Welcome to the Great Sources Season 2, Episode 17. Today's shir is called Knesses Yisrael's Trial. Did we pass or fail? Before we begin today's shir, we are going to quickly review last week's discussion. Last week we spoke about the machloikis at length. We spoke about the machloikis of Rabbi Yochanan in Mishlakish in Yuma Daf Tesam and Beis about why the Shechina did not return to be Shaira in the Bayis Sheni. We discussed at length, and I'm not going to go into the details, we discussed at length what exactly was the chait that was Gerim, that the return to Eretz Yisrael was not miraculous like the first entry to Eretz Yisrael in the days of Yehoshua, Bein L'Reish Lakish, Bein Rabbi Yochanan, the connection of all that to the Bittul Yitzud Avodah Zarah, upon which depends Nevuah too. That's what we discussed last week, and I won't go into reviewing the details. Today, what we're going to talk about is something, a point that's related to that, which is this test that Rish Lakish Dash and Zuma Daf test. Rish Lakish says, Im Chayma, there was a question whether Bnei Yisrael would be a Chayma or not. What exactly is the test according to Rish Lakish, and what is that corresponding test according to Rabbi Yochanan? Okay, let's explain what the question is. So we have the Gemara in Yuma Daf Tesam and Beis, where Rish Lakish says that when the pasuk says in Yashirim that there's a question of whether Bnei Yisrael is a chayma or not, are they a wall or not? And the story in Yashirim goes, meaning if you look in the Yashim itself, there's this question about the Isha, is she a chayma or not? And she responds and says, Ani chayma, I am a chayma. A chayma is a good thing. So Rish Lakish says that the question of whether Bnei Yisrael is a chayma or not means, will Bnei Yisrael come back to Eretz Yisrael kachayma after the galus of Bavel? And according to Rish Lakish, the answer is no, they weren't. They failed. So, according to Rish Lakish, you have this drama in Shirashim, let's call it a drama, where there's a question whether the Isha is a chayma or not. And the way the Shirashim goes is she declares Ani chayma. According to Rish Lakish, that has yet to happen. Klal Yisrael hasn't lived up to this question of whether there'll be a chayma or not. And because of that, the Shechina did not return. Now, it's important to note that this is not stam a drasha ba'alma of Rish Lakish, if there is such a thing as a drasha ba'alma, but this is actually the oimek of Shir Hashirim. Shir Hashirim is a song about love, and in its oimek, it relates to the love between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, it's not the time and place to discuss this. Perhaps in another forum, it's an interesting thing to discuss how Shir Hashirim is all about that. Perhaps that's for another time, but nothing to do with this particular series. My point is merely that Rish Lakish's drasha, and this is something that you have to understand Medrash really to know this. Rish Lakish's drasha about whether Klal Yisrael is a chayma or not, and how he applies that to the end of Bayis Rishon is not stam. You read it, you think like, where did he get this from? It's very mavus. It's very based on understanding what Shir Hashirim is all about, and Shir Hashirim is about the relationship between Hashem and Klal Yisrael, which in the Shir Hashirim drama, it ends with this question, is the woman, Knesses Yisrael, is she a chayma or not? So Rish Lakish very appropriately applies this dramatic kind of question in the mashal of Shir Hashirim to the end of the history of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesses Yisrael, which is the end of Bayis Rishon, or the end of Galus Bavel, when Nevuah is coming to an end, and the question is Knesses Yisrael up to the task of returning to Hashem like a chayma? So this is very basically basic learning of Shir Hashirim. It's not this mehechatesa kind of drasha, which leads to the question that, okay, according to Rish Lakish, we know how we read Shir Hashirim. There's a test whether Knesset Yisrael is going to be like a chayma or not, and unfortunately they were not, and it ends in failure. According to Rabbi Yochanan, however, Rabbi Yochanan says we couldn't have returned, or even if we, let's put it this way, Rabbi Yochanan says even if we would have all returned to Bayis Sheni, the Shechina still would not have come back. So this leads to the question, how does Rabbi Yochanan read this major test, this trial, at the end of Shir Hashirim, is Knesset Yisrael a chayma or not? So, in other words, given that this is not just a random drush, like I said, this is a real reading of Shir Hashirim, that there's a test of Knesses Yisrael, are they or are they not a chayma? That is the trial of Knesses Yisrael, the woman in Shir Hashirim. And that's how Shir Hashirim ends. And that's why Rabbi Lakish reads that the history between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesses Yisrael of the Nevuah, of the Tanakh, ends with Klal Yisrael failing at their test of being a chayma. How does Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that the lack of return wasn't a failure, right? According to Rabbi Yochanan, even if we would have all returned, the Shekhinah wouldn't have come back anyways. It was wrong, right? Rabbi Yochanan holds everyone was supposed to come back, but it wasn't the failure of Klal Yisrael, because even if they would have all returned, the Shekhinah wouldn't come back. So how does Rabbi Yochanan then read the test of are they a chayma or they are not a chayma? This is a very valid question, even if I wouldn't know the medrash that deals with this question. But given that we're going to go through now a psikta that actually deals with this question, the background of really me putting forth this question was really helpful to understand what the psikta is doing. But the psikta clearly is coming to deal with this. So basically, we're going to go through a psikta now, which is going to give us the clues to understand how Rabbi Yochanan understands the question of whether Knesses Yisrael is a chayma or not. And why are we doing this? Because what we're going to see is that perhaps according to Rabbi Yochanan's reading of the trial, right, capital T's, perhaps according to Rabbi Yochanan's reading of the trial and the path that history took, the path that the history of Knesses Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu took, perhaps that means that our relationship with Hashem has changed in some way, and perhaps coming back kachayma, which is what Rish Lakish wanted us to do back in the day when we had that opportunity, and what, as we've been discussing, what the Kuzi says we should do as soon as we have the opportunity again. Perhaps according to Rabbi Yochanan, maybe something is different in terms of the history of our relationship with Hashem and the nature of our relationship with Hashem, such that that's no longer what's expected from us. That is what we're going to explore today. But first, we have to understand, how does Rabbi Yochanan explain Im Chayma? So for this, you have to read the Psikta. You have to learn the Psikta very well. This is source sheet number 2. I'm going to paraphrase the Psikta outside. We're not going to read it inside. It's, of course, worthy, if you want to learn this properly, to read the Psikta inside and see where and in what beautiful fashion the Medrash says all these great Ramazim. The Psikta starts with the Pasuk in Zechariah that goes, Rani v'simchi bas tziyon, ki hineni ba v'shechanti b'soich nom Hashem. And the Psikta says, okay, so basically Zechariah was enough in the beginning of Sheni, says that the Shekhinah is going to return. The Shekhinah did not return. Says the Psikta, because the Pasuk says in Shir Hashirim, Im Chaymahi. And then the Psikta launches into Rish Lakish's idea that, you know why the Shekhinah didn't come back to the Sheni? Is because they had to be a Chayma. So what the Psikta is doing is coming to answer, how does the Pasuk in Zechariah say, Rani v'simchi bas tziyon, ki hineni ba v'shechanti b'soich, and that didn't take place? And the answer is that it's conditional on, we'll look at another place in Tanakh, in Shir Hashirim. You can't just read the pasuk in Zechariah. You have to get the whole picture. The whole picture is Im Chaymahi. There's a test. And if Knesses Yisrael would have been like a Chayma, which means, says the Psikta, like Rish Lakish, returning all together, then indeed the Shekhinah would have returned. But alas and alack, they didn't all come back. Then Rabbi Yitzchak gives an alternative. It's because of Talmud Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yitzchak says, no, the Shekhinah wasn't shown in the Bayis Sheni because it was built by a descendant of Yefes. That's like Shittas Rabbi Yochanan in Yuma Daf Tes and Beis. And then the Psikta launches into a whole drasha, which is not obviously related, but I'm going to explain to you how it's very much related. The Psikta goes into the following drasha. It says the following. It says, Bnei Yisrael who came back from Galus Bavel and built the Bayis Sheni under the auspices of Koresh, such that the Shekhinah couldn't be sharing it, they're the ones upon whom Shlomo Melech says, Eishes Chayil Miyimtza. Eishes Chayil Miyimtza is Knesses Yisrael when they went into Galus. Because the Malachi Ashara says the Psikta, said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how can you let them go into Galus? How can you send them into Galus for having done Avodah Zarah? If they did Avodah Zarah in Eretz Yisrael, for sure, they're going to do Avodah Zarah among the nations. Said HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Batach b'alev bala, I trust them, they're going to cleave to me, says Hashem, Eishes Chayil Miyimtza, and they're not going to follow Avodah Zarah. And actually, not only are they going to be moiser themselves for me, they're going to be moiser nefesh for me, not only that, but they're going to bring others close to me, meaning they're going to cause Gerim, they're going to cause Gerim to be Megayer. Okay. Gemalasu toiv v'loy ra. They always say good about me and not evil. I trust my children are going to do good for me, and therefore the Medrash continues. That's why Shlomo Melech praises them and says, and that's why it says im choima. So working backwards, the last thing that the Medrash says is that Knesses Yisrael and Golos was in fact a choima. And how were they a choima? Because they were Moshe Nefesh, and they avoided Avodah Zarah, and in fact they brought Gerim back on them. So I want to explain to what the Psikta is doing, why it launches into this debate. Okay, meaning first Rish Lakish says, the Medrash says, like Rish Lakish, that Rani v'Simchi Basin Kinim B'Shchanti B'Seichich would have happened had they been a choima. And then Rebbe says, no, it can't happen anyways, because it was built by Yefes. And then it goes into the fact that they actually were a choima because of Exile Miyimtza. Now, what's going on over here? What's going on is that according to Rabbi Yitzchak, we actually did what we were supposed to do in Galus. We did exactly what we were supposed to do. We passed our trial, which is to be faithful to Hashem. Now, but that leads to the question then, where's the Shechina? Right? Which is exactly what the Medrash started with. The Medrash starts to answer a question. It didn't happen. Teretz says it's conditional. Then Rabbi Yitzchak goes ahead and says, actually, they fulfilled the condition of Im Chayma. Okay, well now we have a major problem, right? So the Shekhinah is supposed to return, of course, conditional on Shir Hashirim, which is the test of, which is the relationship between Hashem and Knesses Yisrael. It's Pashut that Knesses Yisrael has to live up to what Shir Hashirim wants of them, which is to be a Chayma. But then Rabbi Yitzchak, who, of this sheet, goes that Chayma and Shir Hashirim means to be faithful to Hashem. And he says, we are the Eishes Chayil. The Eishes Chayil, that's the woman of Shir Hashirim, the great woman. So, well, then we're back to square one. Why didn't the Shekhinah return? So, I want to explain to you what the Psikta is doing. And that's just a phrase in case you were following the exact cheshbon. We have that the Shekhinah's return, as predicted in Zechariah, is contingent on what it says in Shashim, where there's this, if this, then yes, if that, then no. Meaning there's like a Tanai in Shashim. Shlakish explains it very neatly. Yes, Zechariah says Shekhinah to return, but they didn't fulfill the Tanai. Rabbi Yitzchak says they actually fulfilled the Tanai in Shir Hashirim, and we, Knesses Yisrael, are the Eishes Chayil, we're faithful to Hashem. So we have to explain then, well, why didn't the Shekhinah return? And also the Medrash Gufa starts off coming to explain why the Shekhinah didn't return and seems to have dropped that question. So I want to explain to you the answer. By the way, Agav, the Medrash says that in Galus we're going to be faithful to Hashem, and not only that, we're going to bring Gerim. That's also like Shit Subi Yechanan in Psachim, Daf Peizayin and Beis, where he says that the purpose of Galus is to bring Gerim. Okay, now, so I want to explain to you what the Psikta means. How is it that the Shekhinah didn't return while we, in fact, lived up to our great trial, or not lived up to the great test of being a Chayma, being faithful to Hashem in Golus, which is Rabbi Yitzchak's reading of Chayma. Chayma means to be faithful to Hashem. So here's the idea. The Psikta says that the Chayma, being faithful to Hashem, is that we didn't do Avodah Zarah in Golus Bavel, right? The Malach Yeshua said we would, and no, we didn't. Now, what does that mean we didn't do Avodah Zarah b'mei Golus Bavel? Is there a story that we can point to? Is there some evidence to that? The answer is yes. The story of Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah, when Nebuchadnezzar set up a statue and they refused to bow, that is the story of Knesses Yisrael not doing Avodah Zarah in Golus Bavel. This is what it says in the Shir Hashirim Rabbah. Loi avdu Yisrael Avodah Zarah b'mei Nebuchadnezzar haketzad, says the Medrash, and the beautiful Medrash, we're going to refer to numerous parts of it. Haketzad, did they not do Avodah Zarah b'mei Nebuchadnezzar? Because Nebuchadnezzar chose 3 people from Knesses Yisrael to do, from Klal Yisrael to do Avodah Zarah, and those were Chadai, Mishael, and Azariah, and they refused. Turns out that Bnei Yisrael did not do Avodah Zarah b'mei Nebuchadnezzar. So the story of Chadai, Mishael, and Azariah is the story of us withstanding Avodah Zarah in Golus Bavel, against what the Malach Yeshar expected, right? Which has a deep meaning. We're not going to go into that. Now, I want to tell you something very important. There's also in that Medrash Shir Hashirim. When we talk about the Bittul Yitzud Avodah Zarah, when did that happen? Now, the Gemara in Yuma talks about Nachman Sakadel doing it, but of course it could be attributed to, it could be related to certain events. The Medrash Rabbah says that Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah, when they didn't bow to Avodah Zarah, b'mei Nebuchadnezzar, that's what affected the Bittul Yitzud Avodah Zarah. Okay? So, now let's put it all together. The Medrash, the Psikta says that we're supposed to be faithful to Hashem. We're going to be faithful to Hashem in Golus. And that's what Hashem said back to Malachi Yashar. And Hashem said, not only are they going to be faithful to me in Galus, but they're in fact going to attract Gerim. Now we know that the way that we didn't do Avodah Zarah in Galus Bavel was through the Bittul Yitzhak Avodah Zarah. Aha. Now, the Medrash says further, the Gerim are going to come. They were going to attract Gerim. Makes perfect sense. Why? Because Bittul Yitzhak Avodah Zarah goes along with the Bittul of Nevuah, as we discussed. Nevuah is only for Bnei Yisrael. That we know Hashem, we have a certain relationship with Hashem. These are the ramifications here. Some from the Kuzri, some from a Gemara, some from Rashi and Sanhedrin. That's number 6 through 9. That only Bnei Yisrael could be Nevi'im. So, which means that our relationship with Hashem, the familiarity which we have with Hashem, is what allows for Nevuah. Goyim can't be Nevi'im. When we are mevatel the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, which means we put in place a new form of Avodas Hashem, which is not related to having a familiarity with Hashem, right? We discussed this brief last week, I think, or maybe the week before, that with the Bittul Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, Nevuah comes to an end, because the idea is that we're no longer serving Hashem in a let's call it relatable, experiential kind of way. Instead, worship of Hashem is completely intelligent, meaning it's completely a matter of seichel. Therefore, Goyim are also invited, because it has nothing to do now, no longer has anything to do, Avodas Hashem, it does nothing to do with our particular experience of Hashem. When our Avodas Hashem is based on which is when the 1,000 years of Nevuah began, as we discussed, then Goyim are out. Now that we're mevatel the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, now Avodas Hashem becomes a more of an intellectual matter. So all Goyim are invited too. You can look at season 1, episode 8, called Understanding the History of Judaism, Alternative to Kuzri, for more understanding about this. Okay. Now, what are we doing with this? So I'm saying that the Medrash, the Psik that says we were faithful to Hashem because we didn't do Avodah Zarah. That's not just we didn't do Avodah Zarah, we were mevatel Yitzhak Avodah Zarah. And which means we changed the nature of religion. It no longer became about Nevuah, about relating to Hashem in a tangible, experiential way, but it came about knowing Hashem in a, let's call it, logical way, okay? Or maybe intellectual way is better. Okay, so, therefore, all nations are invited. That's why we attract Gerim, because it has nothing to do with our particular experiences that we had with Hashem. We mentioned, I think, 2 weeks ago that Rabbi Yochanan says, this is in the source sheet number 10, Rabbi Yochanan says, when we come back to Galus, the Leiv Ragaz comes back with us, meaning the midas that we get in Galus come back with us. Now we understand, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, the going to Galus Bavel and withstanding Avodah Zarah in a very specific way, the purpose of all that was to attract the Goyim and to change Judaism, change the nature of serving Hashem, so that the whole world is invited to participate in that. Well, the whole world is invited to participate in that means we bring back all the problems that we pick up from Galus, we bring them back with us to Eretz Yisrael. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says, the Leiv Ragos comes back with us. I'm trying to say parenthetically, I mentioned that there's a question that the Rabbi Yochanan says in Nedarim, Daf Chav Beis, that a kind of cruel murder could only happen in Chutz La'aretz, not in Eretz Yisrael, because Pasuk says Shom Leiv Ragos, and that's a stira. I mentioned this last time. I think the answer is as follows. Rabbi Yochanan says the return from Galus Bavel, Bimei Ezra, which was establishing an Avodas Hashem without a Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, and therefore an invitation for Goyim to come, which is like the second pasuk, by the way, in Zechariah. Rani v'simchi bas tzion kiniva b'shechanti v'seichich v'nilvu Goyim rabim el Hashem b'yamahu. It's a kind of return that is supposed to be Goyim rabim too. That kind of return to Eretz Yisrael, where the Goyim are invited to come with us, is the kind where Rabbi Yochanan says, well, you bring your Leiv Ragos with you. In Rabbi Yochanan's time, when Ula was on his way back to Eretz Yisrael, the invitation for everyone to come back from Bavel and to bring the Goyim with him, that was over by then. Tkufa Bayesheni was coming to an end. We spoke of in the past when the Tkufa Bayesheni was over. But we could say that the story of Rabbi Yochanan with Ula, when Ula was witness to a brutal murder, and Rabbi Yochanan says, yeah, it could happen in Chutz La'aretz, but it wouldn't happen in Eretz Yisrael. That's because at that point, people are returning to Eretz Yisrael, not with all the goyim. The vision of a Nilvu goyim Rabbim al Hashem B'Yemahu was no longer had a potential of happening, or at least wasn't being acted on. So therefore, at that point, if a person were returned to Eretz Yisrael, he's returning as an individual, and he could leave behind his Galus Midas. Okay. Now, what is my point? What does this do for us? What does this do for us? I'm trying to explain the Psikta. The Psikta says that we were in fact faithful to Hashem by not doing Avodah Zarah, and yet the Shechina didn't return. Why not? So, I explained that we were faithful to Hashem by not doing Avodah Zarah. How? By being mevatel the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, and from mevatel Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, along with that, we're mevatel Yitzhak Nevuah. And Memela, on the one hand, we could say Ani Choyma. On the one hand, it's true that we were faithful to Hashem. We didn't do Avodah Zarah. On the other hand, the way that we didn't do Avodah Zarah was by excising that whole passion, that whole interest, that whole Yetzer, and therefore, along with that, throwing out to a certain kind of connection with Hashem. Now, I'm going to explain a little more how this works out into the Psukim in Zechariah and to the Psikta. But before, I want to tell you an amazing medrash that this is key to understanding. The medrash says, it's an amazing medrash, this is at length in number 12 in the source sheet, that when Nebuchadnezzar decreed that everyone has to have Avodah Zarah, Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah went to Daniel to ask him what to do. Should we bow or not? They said, we're planning on not bowing, and is that a good idea? He said, go ask the Navi, go ask Yechezkel. So it's implying Daniel wasn't the Navi, which is a big question. They went to Yechezkel, and he said, I want to ask Hashem what to do. Hashem told him, so basically, what was the question? We're planning on letting him throw us into the fire. Will Hashem save us or not? That's what they wanted to know. So Yechezkel says, I gotta have to ask Hashem. He says to Hashem, are you going to save them or not? And Hashem says, no, I am not going to save them. Yechezkel brought them back that message, and Yechezkel was distraught that Hanai, Mishael, and Azariah are going to die, and he told them, yeah, Hashem's not going to save you. They said, you know what? Whether Hashem is saving us or not, we're jumping in the fire. And that's what Darshans the Psukim Daniel, that they originally said we're going to jump in because they were sure Hashem would save them. They asked the Navi, and the Navi said Hashem said he's not going to save you. They said, you know what? We're jumping in even if Hashem's not going to save us. And then they left Yechezkel, and Hashem comes back to Yechezkel and says, you think I'm not going to save them? Of course I'm going to save them. But I want them to go b'tmimus. Nifladika medrash. And I'll explain to you what it means. And the medrash continues and says, that's why people say, there's an oath, there's a shvuah, that Hashem established the world on 3 pillars, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and some say the 3 pillars are Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah, because of this story. I'll explain to you what this means. This is a shocking medrash. Yechezkel said a lie, or Hashem told him a lie. Right? That's the medrash saying. What does that mean? What's the idea of that? The idea is that Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah are going to withstand the temptation of Avodah Zarah, but in a way that brings an end to Nevuah too. Right? Because Bitul Avodah Zarah and Nevuah, and the end of Nevuah goes together. So therefore we have this story where the Navi told them an untruth. And in fact, in the model of Nevuah, where what Hashem does makes sense and is revealed, Hashem would save them. Of course Hashem would save them. And in fact he did. But the point is that he had to hide from them, he had to make himself unknown, and that's going to be the way that they withstand Avodah Zarah, by Hashem supposedly not saving them, and they're going to withstand Avodah Zarah also. That's kind of service of Hashem that's appropriate in the Tkufa where there's no Nevuah. So therefore that's typified by this story where the Navi actually was given a false Nevuah. Now, and that's what the Medrash means. There's Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Hanai, Mishael, Azariah. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov are the ones who represent the pillars of the Tkufa of Nevuah. And then there's Hanai, Mishael, Azariah. They're corresponding to the 3 pillars of the world. That little story there in Daniel, because they are initiating this Tkufa of serving Hashem when Hashem is unrevealed, Behelim, which again, like we said, is typified by the story of the Navi bringing them a false message. Amazing. Okay, now, so what does that mean? So what does that mean? So now, let's think about this. As we said, we are faithful to Hashem. We passed our test. But we passed our test in a very interesting way. We didn't pass our test by being able to do battle with Yitzhak Zara straight. We passed our test by completely being oiker that Yitzhak Zara. Therefore what? Therefore we no longer have Nevuah in the model that it used to be. What we do have, however, is an invitation to the Goyim, because now it's a different kind of service of Hashem which everyone can participate in. And now what do we need to wait for? Well, now the ball is not in our court. That's the idea here. Because once we did something that invites the Goyim to participate in Avodas Hashem, and well, the Shekhinah is not Shaira on Goyim, but maybe the Goyim have to become part of something. There has to be a process, there has to be a long process in history that the Goyim have to change and become subsumed in something. So my point is as follows. And I know I'm really marich in this, it's a very deep thing, and it's not the place for it. But Rani v'simri bas tzion kineni baba shachanti v'seichich v'nilvu goyim rabim al Hashem b'yimahu means the following. Hashem said, I will dwell amongst you. When the process of the goyim becoming part of you will be completed. Then the Shekhinah will return to Knesses Yisrael. So now the question that the Pesikta starts with, Rani v'simri bas tzion kineni baba shachanti v'seichich, it didn't happen. Didn't we do everything we have to? So Rish Lakish's answer is no, we didn't do everything we have to. Rabbi Yochanan's answer is yes, we did everything we have to. And once we do everything I have to, the Shekhinah is going to return. When it has its effects. When V'nilvu Goyim Rabim al Hashem, when the Goyim all learn what started by Hanan Mishal Vazai, which was impressed to all the nations, when that runs its course, then the Shekhinah is going to return. Now, like I said, what's going to change? How will the Goyim integrate? In what way? Such that the Shekhinah could be Shaira, given that the Shekhinah is only Shaira on Yisrael. Ein kama Goyim elaharech. I do want to make one point, and then I want to get to the main point that I'm bringing this all up for. One point is that there are people who say, like the Satmarov, we mentioned him once, says we're supposed to be in Galus because we have to get Gerim, like Rabbi Yechanan says, in Psachim. I don't think that's correct, because we did that already by Hanan Mishal Azariah. This idea that we went to Galus in order to attract Gerim, that happened by Hanan Mishal Azariah being Moser Nefesh in front of the Nebuchadnezzar. That major Roshim, that was the introduction to the world of Judaism and the power of serving Hashem. And that's enough. Everything else happens from there. My proof to that is, because Rabbi Yochanan, who says we went to Galus in order to be Mosif Gerim, Rabbi Yochanan himself holds that everyone was supposed to come back maybe by a Sheni. Who's going to be Mosif Gerim? The answer is, this is not an ongoing agenda that we have. Hanan and Shalazar have accomplished it. Ani Chayma, we did what we have to do, and now it could run its course, which is just a shocking thing. It means that the relationship between Hashem and Klal Yisrael, in one, according to Rabbi Yochanan, in a certain sense, we lived up to what we have to do. Ani Chayma, it's amazing. Eishes Chayim Miyim, says the Pesikta says. However, on the other hand, as we said, we did it in a very specific way, such that now we have to wait for it to have its effects. Okay, now, this point that I'm about to get to right now, this is the point that I brought up this whole medrash for. Should we learn from this that according to Rabbi Yochanan, we shouldn't go back to Eretz Yisrael in an independent way, given the choice? Meaning, the original model of the Torah, let's call it, is that we should take Eretz Yisrael, be independent there, and be separate from the Goyim, and know Hashem, and be Nevi'im, and connecting to Hashem through the Eretz. Beautiful. According to Rish Lakish, that model hasn't changed, and in fact, we failed when we were supposed to bring back that model. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, we introduced a new model. The new model is not a failure. It's Ani Chayma, it's Eishes Chayim Miyimtza, and that new model is something that involves the Goyim, and is a bittul Yitzhak Zara, and is a bittul of Nevuah, at least for now, which means that the ideal of us being in Eretz Yisrael independent of the Goyim, l'chayra, is over. And therefore, could one say that actually we have a whole completely different role, we've changed the course of our relationship with Hashem. Now we are Ani Chayim, we are the Eishes Chayim Miyimtza because we're faithful to Hashem, we don't do Avodah Zarah, and Taka, pat ourselves on the back, we Taka do not do Avodah Zarah, it's an amazing thing. And that's our role. Zehu, our role is to stay faithful and to wait. Maybe we don't have to look for an opportunity to go back to Eretz Yisrael and be mechaper on the chet and the meraglim? This is a very, very powerful and interesting question. Is the new mahalach of religion, which is more universal, and which doesn't depend on all of us going back to Eretz Yisrael. We just have to be neman to Hashem, be the Eish Yisrael, not Tzavah, like we were in the days of Chanaim Shavazai, who really did everything we need to do. Maybe there's nothing left for us to do. Maybe we just have to wait. That's the question, and my belief is that no, certainly that's not the case, because as we explained in last year, the whole conversation in Yuma Daf Tes is really about Bittul Yitzhak Avodah Zarah. Why was it necessary to Mivatul Yitzhak Avodah Zarah? Everyone agrees that that's a b'diavad. Everyone agrees that if we have an opportunity, had we had the opportunity to be mechaper on the chet meraglim, and to put into effect the original model of Nemanos to Hashem, meaning originally we were supposed to go and embrace Eretz Yisrael and therefore not to Avodah Zarah Gilu Eshech Dam. We never did that. If we would have had the opportunity to do that in Bayis Sheni, Bein Lo Rish Lakish, Bein Lo B'Yechon, as we discussed, of course that's what we're supposed to do. B'Yechon holds we didn't have the opportunity. We didn't have that opportunity, but yet we were Neman to Hashem in a different way. We were Neman to Hashem, we were Ani Chayma in a way of Bittul Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, instead of doing it by fighting with the demons, the original demon of Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, and actually doing battle with it and overcoming it, instead of Mevatel it. But that's only because we weren't able to do Ani Chayma in the original way. But if we have an opportunity to be a chayma, and to be chayma meaning like Rish Lakish's chayma, to be oile b'chayma when it's appropriate to, and thereby to be faithful to Hashem and do battle with the Yitzhak Avodah Zarah instead of having to be oikered and change this new thing, which what do we need in order to do that? We need to be able to be mechaper on the chet and meraglim, as we discussed in last year. Nearly borrow that even according to Rabbi Yechanan, we're supposed to do that. And the ikar point is, even if you don't follow or understand all this oimek, the ikar point is, which is still powerful on its own, I believe, the Torah doesn't change. Meaning, the model of the Torah, and the chet and meraglim being the most important problem, that doesn't change even according to Rabbi Yechanan. The fact that there's this intermediate mahalach, or almost as good mahalach, where we could say Eishes Chayil Miyimtza, we could say Ani Chayma because we're amazing, the fact that there's another mahalach doesn't mean that the mahalach set up by the Eretz Yisrael and the meraglim is not still something that we're supposed to strive for. Can't really borrow. So my point is even according to Rabbi Yechanan, that there was another mahalach that was set up, which is a faithfulness to Hashem by not doing Avodah Zarah and staying faithful to Hashem within Galus. That doesn't mean we're not supposed to look to reinitiate the first model. There's deeper things about this to be said, which I don't plan on going into. I have to think, now it's occurring to me, maybe I should give one more shir about this and explain what this is really about. Perhaps it is kedai. I think, however, this does suffice for understanding halamaisidik what we're supposed to do and what we can take out of Rabbi Yechanan's understanding of Ani Chayma. Basically, the ikar is that last point, the Torah doesn't change, and we still have to take that first model of the Chet Meraglim and the Oretz as being the center of everything. There's another small har that I want to deal with. There's a Medrash Tehillim, and now we're on number 13 in the source sheet. There's a pasuk in Tehillim that says, "The source of light is with you." It says we want to see light with your light. It says in a mashal, there was a fellow who was walking at night, and he kept on lighting a candle, and it kept on going out. And he said, "You know what? I'm going to stop trying to light this candle. I'm just going to wait till sunrise." Kach, Yisrael nishtabdu Mitzrayim, and Moshe and Aaron redeemed them. Bavel, Chananim Shalazai redeemed them. Yavan, Matasyo, Chashon redeemed them. Then they were nishtabed in Edom. Klal Yisrael said, "We're tired from being redeemed and going back into Shibud. We don't want Basav Adam to light a candle for us. We want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to redeem us," as the pasuk says, "Keil Hashem v'yor lanu." Okay. So this idea that things happen in the past like Basav Adam, in the future you want them to happen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So I have two questions. Question number one. Is this the same idea as Rabbi Yechanan's Shita, that we no longer look to know Hashem, rather we're faithful to Hashem by being mevatel Yitzhak Avodah Zarah, which is more of a passive thing. We're not trying to know Hashem, we're just trying to not do something wrong. Is this the same Shita? In which case we could infer from this that in fact Rabbi Yechanan holds that we are supposed to dafka stick to that mahalach and not look to know Hashem even if we can. Not look to, as it were, fight with the vis-à-vis even if we can, and basically get back Eretz Yisrael independently. Is that what we can learn from Rabbi Yochanan? The answer is no, absolutely not. Because Rabbi Yochanan says that there were geulas by humans, and he gives 3 examples of that: Moshe, Chanai, Mishael, Azariah, and Matisyahu. Now, Chanai, Mishael, Azariah, they're the ones who were mevatel the vis-à-vis, and yet that's called the geula de basar v'dam. So clearly, Rabbi Yochanan is not talking about this idea of whether we're supposed to know Hashem or whether we're supposed to be passive in terms of our our relationship with Hashem. He's talking about something else legamri. He's talking about putting geula into effect is supposed to happen by humans. Is supposed to happen now. It's supposed to happen by Hashem and not by humans. Okay, fine, but that raises another question. This is a very important medrash. Does this medrash teach us that we are not supposed to do anything to affect our geula? Right? That's what the medrash says. We're waiting for Hashem. But actually, that's also incorrect, and I'll tell you why. The medrash says we're not supposed to do anything waiting for Hashem. Okay, what about Mashiach? Are we okay with Mashiach? We'll put it this way. The medrash says, oh, Moshe did it the first time, Moshe and Aaron, and then Chanai, Mishael, Azariah, then Chashmonaih, Banav, now we just want Hashem. Let's say a Moshe kind of thing would happen again. Clearly the medrash is saying that's not sufficient, right? So Hashem talking to Moshe and sending Moshe, that wouldn't be enough, right? So we want something more than that. Okay. So this is not about what typically talk about, okay, don't take things natural terms, wait for a Navi. This is Moshe won't suffice, right? Now we have to understand, wait a second, Moshe won't suffice, but Mashiach will. Why is that? Why? I thought we were waiting for Hashem. The answer to that, I think, is the Gemara in Babasa Fayin Hey and Beis says, Rabbi Yochanan himself said, in the future, tzaddikim are going to be nikra b'shmoy shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And another member there is that 3 things are called Hashem and His, Baruch Hu, tzaddikim and Mashiach and Yerushalayim. So Mashiach specifically and all tzaddikim in general are called b'shem Hashem. So when Rabbi Yochanan says in the Medrash Tehillim that we no longer want a Yeshua of basar v'dam, we want a Yeshua de HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it means the Yenet Tzaddik Mashiach who's nikra Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe is not enough. We need a tzaddik who's nikra Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. These are very strange ideas to explain. Saydus basically. And it's not what we think it is. It's not what we think it is, that we need miraculous things and not human things. Again, because the Medrash is saying we won't even accept the geula of Moshe. That's miraculous, right? We don't want a geula of Mitzrayim even. We want something else. We want a geula of basar v'dam. We want a geula of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which even Mashiach is considered a geula of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as I said, because the Gemara says in Babasa that eventually tzaddikim will be nikra Hashem and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So clearly these things are referring to Saydus that need to be explained, but do not mean what they seem to mean on face value. It certainly does not mean what I think it means on face value, that we're supposed to be passive. It means something's going to happen that's Nikra Shmesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What is that and what it means, I'm not sure, but my main point is it's not what we think it means. 2 points. It's not what we think. That might think that Rabbi Yochanan is saying that there's a new kind of mahalach called Ani Chayma, which is passive in terms of our relation with Hashem instead of active. No, that's certainly not what he means, because even Chanai, Mishael, Azariah are considered the ones that are basar v'dam. Nor can we learn out from Rabbi Yochanan that we're supposed to be passive and not active because things have to happen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like the Samarov's kind of things happening at the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because Rabbi Yochanan says Moshe wouldn't suffice for this, and Mashiach would. So clearly there's some sort of deep idea here of what it means to be at the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I don't know what it is. Like I said, I was planning on next week to get to the question of mitzvahs tluis ba'aretz. I have to think about it whether it is necessary to have one more conversation about the nature of nevuah, return of nevuah, and Rabbi Yochanan Shita about Anichayim. I have to think about that. But otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the next year, a few shiurim about whether the mitzvahs tluis ba'aretz, the challenge of fulfilling a mitzvah tluis ba'aretz, does that pose any problem to returning to Eretz Yisrael, or does that perhaps make it not a mitzvah to return to Eretz Yisrael? That will take us a couple of shurim. After that, we'll be ready to discuss what the maskanas are, the maisa. That will be a few shurim. And after that, a few more shurim will be to explain the inyan of Eretz Yisrael. What is Eretz Yisrael all about? What's the idea of Eretz Yisrael all about?